Welcome to the Reflections on the Emerald Hills of the Heart by Dr. Zaman Senazai, professor at the Pacifica Graduate Institute and California State University. Today, we're going to have the topic as Muslims and who we have become. But before we delve into this topic with Dr. Zaman Senazai, there are there's a question that I'd like to put forward from the last program, which is in chapter Ali Imran, Allah uses khalaqa for Adam's creation, though, and not ja'ala. What's your approach to that verse, Dr. Senazai? Please.
Good evening, good morning, or whatever other timed reading applies. I hope everyone is well. I'm glad to be here with you again. Since we are starting with the Inquisition at the beginning, let's deal with it right away. For those of you who are watching the program for the first time, I said in the last program that the biblical Adam is different from the Quranic Adam, that the biblical Adam is the first human being, whereas the Quranic Adam is not the first being, but an evolved being from the first human being. And the reason I argued this way is that when Quran refers to humanity, it uses the word khalaqa, khalaqa al-insana. We created humanity. And so that is some stage in the evolution of the earth, the animal kingdom, whatever you want to call it. And the word is very specific. Khalaqa in terms of a human being, but also khalaqa min nafsin wahida. We have created humanity from a single entity. In other words, there is no primacy of gender, that man was created first and then the human was created from the man and all that. That is all biblical, it's not Quranic. So Quranic says we created you from a single cell, we created humanity, and for all of this the word khalaqa is used in Arabic, which means created. Whereas in reference to Adam, it uses the word ja'ala, which means evolved or transformed. And from that, we evolved the human being, which complies perfectly with the theory of evolution. And whether Charles Darwin knew enough Quran or whether he referenced it or not, that's a different story. But the Quran had stated it 1400 years earlier, at least 1400 years from now, that the Adam, the Quranic Adam, is an evolved being, and the word used is ja'ala. The question being asked is that my documentation was that Quran consistently uses these two words for very critical distinction. The question that is posed says, what about the case of the Surah Al-Imran, which is the third surah in the Quran, where the word khalaqa is used. Now, this very intelligent reader obviously had done his research, but if we read the whole ayah, an ayah is the equivalent of a verse, and many people do call it verse. I don't, for a different reason that I might explain sometimes later. But basically, ayah is a unit of meaning. Whether it grammatically fits into a phrase, a sentence, or a paragraph, it doesn't matter. So some ayahs are like a very long paragraph. Other ayahs are maybe just a few letters, not even a sentence. And some of them would be the equivalent of a sentence or a phrase. So that's the basic distinction, that a verse is a grammatical unit, whereas an ayah is a semantic unit. It's a unit of a meaning. Now, this particular ayah number 59, reads as follows. Let me read it in Arabic first. إن مثل عيسى عند الله كمثل آدم خلقه من تراب ثم قال له كن فيكون. Verily, in the sight of God, the nature of Jesus is as the nature of Adam, whom he created out of dust and then said unto him, be, and he was. The reason, this is the only incident, as far as I know, in the Quran where the word khalaqa is used next to Adam. But my understanding is that it's not used in reference to Adam, because the subject is Jesus here. For most of you, I'm sure know, but for the few of you who may not know, Quran is not a written text. It's not an edited text. It is a text that was spontaneously revealed in the context of certain circumstances. And so therefore, in many cases, it's probably a response to a question being posed to the Prophet. And I'm making an assumption in this case that perhaps people question that if Jesus was born not in the ordinary sense, but that he was born to a virgin, and perhaps there were questions about that. And so this is Quran's response to that, that not all creations are quote unquote in the normal sense, genetically speaking, biologically speaking, that you're born to another human being, that there are some beings that are born not in their normal sense of having a father and a mother. And Jesus's would be one of those cases. So the Quran is probably responding to that to explain how Jesus could be born from a virgin. And so because Jesus is the subject of the sentence, and Adam is used only in reference and in comparison, analogously with Jesus, therefore the verb used as khalaqa, created, because the word jala, transformed or evolved, will not apply to Jesus. And so the appropriateness, if I can use that word, the appropriateness of the khalaqa is more relevant than the word jala. So that would be my answer. And as I had said before, this is, as far as I know, the only incident, but in where khalaqa is used next to Adam. In most all other cases, the word jala is used to make that distinction and to make the point that I was making, is that the Quranic Adam is not the first human being. It is an evolved being. So I hope that's a bad answer to a good question, or maybe, if we're a little optimistic, maybe a good question to a good answer, or the other way around. Then if that is done, we can move on to the subject of the day, which is Muslims, how have we become? The word become again implies another process, an evolutionary process. And what I intend to do with this topic is there are certain terminologies that are used to defining us culturally, or if I can say civilizationally, or in the context of a religious identity. And what I want to concentrate on today is how did those terms evolve or completely change from the way they used to be to the way they have become now. So let me start with the word Islam, which used to be a political identity. We have to think about the circumstance in which the Prophet lived. I think we can go even 500-600 years earlier to the time of Jesus. Jesus was probably, if not the first, one of the first prophets who tried to detribalize religion. Most religions were revelations to a particular tribe. And the Hebrews perceived that all revelations were exclusively for them. And here comes Jesus, who is trying to advocate a message that is universal in nature, that is addressing humanity in general, and not necessarily the Jewish people. However, in terms of politics, especially modern politics, if Jesus did not have the lofty position in the minds of most of us, the way we respect him, the way we love him, many people would have said, well, but he was a bit naive. How could he expect this to happen, to fight the Jewish establishment of the time, to fight the Romans, to fight everyone, and pretty much single-handed? How could he do that? Well, to compare that with the reality of the time of the Prophet Muhammad, Prophet Muhammad was a realist in that sense. So at one level, he dealt with the worldly matters in terms of what mattered to the world community. And he dealt with matters of religion and spirituality in their own terms. And so therefore, in a way, you could say, just like Jesus at the very end, in the very last night before he was crucified, according to the Christian belief, he asked for a sword, but apparently that was too late. And so Jesus' message or Jesus' mission of the universality or universalizing religion in a way failed. What happened to it later, that's a different story. But at the time of Jesus, it in essence failed. And Prophet Muhammad, I'm sure, was aware of that. And therefore, he understood it that the worldly matters have to be dealt with in the currency that was acceptable to the world community. So he established a state so that when he had to preach, he could preach from a position of strength. And therefore, the keywords that I want to discuss that have changed in the course of history is the word Islam, the word Iman, and the word Ummah. From Islam, we get Muslim. From Iman, we get Mu'min, and Ummah is also is applied both ways, for a person as well as for a community. At the time of the Prophet, Islam was a political identity. That is, because the Prophet established a state, a republic, and a civilizational core. The word Medina, that is often perceived as the name of a city, is not the name of a city in which he lived. The name of the city was Yasrib. He changed the name to Medina not because it sounded better, because Medina is the root word for civilization. So he established the core of a civilizational entity, politically speaking. And at that, he also made it a pluralistic community, that the city of Medina was a pluralistic community, not a religious community per se, not a theocracy, not the rule of a particular religion or particular faith. And so because this was a community for all faiths, an all faith community, it was a pluralistic society in that sense. And for those of you who may want to do further research, I think in some ways that was more advanced than our modern state in the following sense. That in modern times, we recognize that there should be a land, a law for the land, the law of the land for all communities, for instance, in the United States. So we all live under one civil law. But that civil law overrides any religious differences, and therefore it says, regardless of what religion you have. Whereas in the Medina model, in civil matters, there was the law of the land, which is called Misaq Medina. Misaq Medina is the civil code that applied to all citizens of Medina, regardless of what faith, what religion they had. But on matters of religion, as societies were more religious at the time, like in matters of inheritance, marriage, divorce, other matters of faith, each community was to adhere to the rules of their own religion, their own scripture, their own book. And in that sense, it had the plurality of religious law for each community, so nobody's faith or religious beliefs will be imposed on another. But on civil matters, and in civil matters, everybody is obviously equal, then they were all adherents to the Misaq al-Medina. And so in that sense, when I say it was more advanced. So therefore, all the citizens of this state were called Muslims. When we take the word Islam as submission, in the political sense, it meant people who submitted, in other words, accepted the citizenship of this state. Now, Muslims at that time may have been believers in Quran or in Bible or in Torah or in whatever other religious faith they had. It didn't matter. They were all called Muslims because Islam was a political identity. However, those who believed in Quran and in Prophet Muhammad, these were called Mu'minun. And again, the Quran addresses each community separately. Matters that relate to the whole state of Medina are referred to Muslimun in the Quran, and matters that refer only to those who believe in the Quran, those are referred to as Mu'minun, or Mu'minun wal Mu'minat, men and women believers in the Quran. And so those people would have been considered to have Iman. Now, also in terms of an ethnic-based identity, ethnic in terms of a national entity, they were all called the Ummah. So Ummah were, again, the citizens of a country. Their political identity would have been Muslim, and their social identity would have been Ummah. So Ummah and Islam were almost synonymous, and they applied to Muslims as well as to non-Muslims. Now, since the Prophet was the head of the state, therefore he was the head of the Muslims. But since he was also the prophet of a new religious community, then he was referred to as the prophet. So these were both of his separate identities. Now, after the life of the Prophet Muhammad, when the righteous caliphs came, the caliphs had to make this distinction very clear. Although some of the titles came at the time of the second caliph, because the first caliph lived a very short time. So it was the time of the second caliph, Umar, when he was called both a Khalifa and Amir al-Mu'mineen. And I'm using the Arabic titles deliberately. Khalifa means the successor to the Prophet as the head of state. So he was Khalifa of the entire state, which at that time covered most of Arabia. But for those who were Mu'minun, who believed in the Quran and the prophethood of Prophet Muhammad, for those people, Khalifa Umar was not just the Khalifa, but also Amir al-Mu'minin, the head of the Muslim community. And these two titles were, again, we overlook this after 1400 years, and we don't think they are significant, but I think they are. And the significance is in that as the head of the Muslim believing community, he was Amir al-Mu'minin, and that's different. Now, what has happened since then, 1400 years yonder, these terms have become pretty much synonymous. So Muslims or Islam does not refer to the citizenship, but rather to a faith community. And Mu'minun Iman already refer to those, and therefore the two terms have become very synonymous. So in today's time, in our modern times, we refer to most believers both in faith and in some cases as members of a particular political community. We refer to all of them as Muslims. So Islam has become equivalent to Iman. The other term that was in use at the time of the Prophet was the term Ummah, which literally means basically a nation or a group of the followers. That term at the time of the Prophet was used again for Muslims as well as for non-Muslims. But in these days, we use it only for Muslims. And so we have monopolized these terms, and we have somehow excluded people of faith belief systems that do not necessarily believe in the Quran. We do not consider them Muslims, and we cannot consider them part of the Ummah, and certainly we do not consider them part of the Mu'minun, or those who have Iman. And I think in that sense, things have changed tremendously. And one of the reasons for the change is that when the Islamic State was established, now remember, Islamic State as a political entity, not necessarily that all people believed in that one particular religion. And those would have been the Mu'minun. The Mu'minun, the people, the believers in the Quran and the Prophet were a minority in most of these states. Obviously, you cannot overnight convert, even if by force, you cannot convert people overnight people into the millions to convert them into a particular faith. So this was a long process, and it happened in most cases voluntarily, and in some cases, unfortunately, due to compulsion for political reasons. We understand that, but the reality is that that Muslims were a minority in these states for a long, long time. Now, what has happened in our time, the changes that have happened, like I referred to, first, linguistically, the terminologies have been changed. And the second thing is that in many of these societies, Muslims have become a majority. And unfortunately, in some of these communities, Muslims have become a suppressive majority. In other words, they do not recognize the pluralism that the Prophet himself accorded to all the other faith communities. And so I think that this is a major change, and I think it's, who am I? But that's just my view, that I think we have become, in a sense, less pluralistic, if not less democratic. So our madaniyat, our Medina, and our civilization, of Muslim civilization, evolved out of that pluralism. And what it evolved to was that because again, let me speak analogously. After the time of Jesus, the Christians were such a minority, and I might add, a persecuted minority, that they were basically an underground movement for almost 300 years. Everybody gave them a hard time, whether it was the Jewish establishment or the state of Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Romans of Rome. So they were a persecuted minority at least for 300 years until they finally were accepted. And being a minority now, from a psychological point of view, gives people a degree of insecurity, the degree of confidence, the degree of assertiveness. All of that is different. And so therefore they were very, very defensive. They were not very receptive, and they remained pretty much an enclave. The thing that worked for the Muslims was different. Islam, God came to this world, now I'm talking about religion, and its scripture and its prophet, and all of this got established both as a religious community, as a civil community, as a state, and its prophet became the head of a state, and therefore they had such a confidence that the initial confidence in the infancy of Islam was to a degree that they were not defensive at all. They were very assertive, they were very receptive, and they were very open. And because of this openness, they were willing to accept the traditions and ways of knowledge of other communities very openly. So when the Christians, when the Greeks, when the Muslims heard that the Greeks were more, let's say, people of reason rather than revelation, that they wanted to prove the existence of God through reason, the Muslims didn't shy away. They said, sure, bring it in. We want to study. We want to find out how they do it. Or if they learn that, say, Hindus are worshiping God through certain manners of meditation and all that, the Muslims said, sure, we want to learn their ways too. And this receptivity resulted in Muslims creating the first civilization that was the first universal civilization. In other words, that it was all inclusive, that earlier civilizations, like the Chinese civilization was Chinese in character, the Hindu civilization was, the Indian civilization was Hindu, the Greek civilization was Greek. But the Muslim civilization was not necessarily Muslim. And as I give you the example, it was all inclusive. And that helped it create this universality, this degree of self-confidence, this degree of receptivity, that they were open to everything, including science, philosophy, and everything. And so the sciences developed, as well as sciences of religion, secular, non-secular, and all that. Now, that gave the Muslims an edge in the sense of kind of expanding throughout the world pretty rapidly. Because, like I said, the Quran has a clear command that there shall be no compulsion in matters of faith. And with Muslims with a sword went to conquer lands, it did not necessarily mean that the conquered would have to convert. And that jives with with the argument I made earlier. Then Muslims remained a minority, and yet they had their rulership established from the borders of France to the borders of China and the Bay of Bengal in a pretty short time. They practically crossed the Pyrenees within 100 years after the life of the Prophet. And that is a lightning speed in historical context. Now, once the Islamic civilization was first established in Baghdad, and then, of course, in Spain, and then expanded to other parts of the Muslim world, this hub of activity was very beneficial to humanity in terms of sciences, technology, algebra, logarithm, chemistry. All these terms are Muslim terms. Chemistry comes from alchemia. Jabr comes from algebra. Algebra comes from Jabr, either way. Logarithm from al-Khwarizmi, and so on and so forth. So Muslims were at the forefront of sciences, and it's in this sense that I'm saying that probably calling it an Islamic civilization is a misnomer, because they were not just concerned with matters of a particular religion or particular scriptures. Of course they were, but they were concerned with the improvement of the lot of humanity in whatever field they encountered. Science, medicine, philosophy. They even took things like Plato's Republic, that was turned into Madinat al-Fazila, which is the Islamic version of it. In other words, they were not shying away from it. What happened then in the course of time, that as much as this was good for Muslims gaining a sense of confidence, that confidence slowly turned into a kind of arrogance. And then the arrogance resulted in a kind of self-centeredness, when Muslims thought that, well, you know, there's nobody around the world who can challenge us, so we are in charge. And it's this arrogance and this hubris syndrome that resulted in their becoming kind of too reluctant, should I say, or too negligent, or too forgetful, or perhaps all of the above. And after a pretty long reign, if I can use that word, of staying on top of the world power center, to a point that they could even take a blow or two from the Mongols from the east and the Crusaders from the west. They still survived those. But eventually around, the 15th, 16th century, I think perhaps the fatigue settled in, and the decline began. And I personally think that I described how we were and how we became in terms of the few terminologies I used, but those terminologies also contained a substance, a substantial change. And the change was that in the early Islam, Muslims were that open to sciences, to philosophy, to logic. However, there were times where the clerics came to the forefront. They became powerful. They gained favor with rulers. And as a result of that, for instance, philosophy and logic and most of these other sciences were pushed aside. They were marginalized. And as these were marginalized, the clerics or the fuqaha, the heads of the religious jurisprudential schools of thought, they became the bosses. They defined what a Muslim identity ought to be. And therefore, they reduced all of Islam into fiqh. All of Islam was reduced into rules and regulations for worship. How to pray, when to pray, and all the other matters that dealt with a person's behavioral pattern, or the procedures for, say, making an ablution, or how many units do you pray in the afternoon, and things of this nature. So these were given priority, and the other things that mattered, which was rationalism, at the age of reason, which they had, which was good governance, which would have been a hikmah or philosophy, which would have been like medical sciences and so on and so forth. Those were marginalized and pushed aside and disenfranchised and neglected. And in the process, the other change that happened was that Islam, as a religious community, was equal to the community of the faithful, and the faithful meant in respect to how they do their rites and rituals. And this reduced the Islamic community into a shell. So the republic that the Prophet established, the public part became private, re-private. That's not a word, I'm just coining it. But the idea was that it became a little too exclusive. And in the process, since religion is often, when combined with politics, it becomes easily, it becomes a means of manipulation very easily. So they became manipulative. And so Muslims lost their creativity, their cutting edge advances, their inventions. Most of those things slowly were kind of pushed aside. And so basically the shell remained, but the substance was gone. So by the time Europe woke up, at the time of colonialism and Protestant Reformation and the other changes that Europe went through, the Muslims were still dismissive of them until the Christians came to their doorsteps as colonial powers and subjugated them. And so the problem we have now is that, let me go back one more thing. Then, of course, at that height, when the fuqaha, who are often referred to as the ulama, but they are not the ulama because ilm is a much more general term than a faqih. So the fuqaha not only got an exclusive right to the seat of power by pushing aside everyone else, but they also came with an unforgivable mission that they convinced the Khalifa that the gate of ijtihad, or the interpretation of matters of religion, ought to be closed completely, and nobody has any right to interpret Quran or any of the religious matters any further other than what they had decided, say, 1,200 years ago or 1,000 years ago. And so the impression was created that the gate to ijtihad is closed, shut, and you're to accept whatever Imam Hanifa or Imam Hanbal or whoever, one of the politically endorsed heads of these schools had said. Our problem today is that when we have problems in the 21st century, those so-called religious scholars have nothing to rely on except to go to all the judicial rulings that were given 1,000 years ago. And they don't make sense in many cases. They are irrelevant because the schools of ijtihad were closed. And so we are left only with decisions that were made, like if you use tort law or common law in the Western sense. So those laws are obsolete. But because we were not allowed to change it in the course of time, we have no choice but, they have no choice but to refer to them. And in most cases, like I said, they do not meet the requirements of our time and space. Now, the splitting of the Shia Islam perhaps had this one advantage, that with the rise of the Safavids, who established their own theocracy, And by theocracy, they tried to drive a wedge between the Sunnis and the Shias as deep as they could, and they did. A lot of the Sunni scholars had to leave Persia. And so all of a sudden they realized that, well, they had this brain drain going on here. That if they don't have these scholars who have left Persia, and now they've created a theocracy, then they better come up with something that is equivalent to all the other literature that they termed as Sunni literature. So then they allowed ijtihad in the Shia schools of thought, which is the Jafari school. And the result was a tremendous amount of thought expression in the deepest sense of the thought. Philosophy came back to life. Reason came back to life, and many scholars, great scholars, developed philosophical treatises and explained matters in their own way since they were allowed to. The state allowed it because they wanted to fill the gap. Now, this was both good and it was bad. It was good because at least if the other four schools, the Maliki, Hanbali, Shafi, and Hanafis, were not allowing this kind of freedom, at least the Jafari school allowed it. So there was that freedom, there was that efflorescence of all the thoughts being expanded and all that. But the bad thing about it was that it was all presented in the context of a Shia thought. And therefore, the Shias being isolated themselves, then the thought also remained isolated with them. So now, if you go to most of the Muslim world outside of Persia, for example, and you try to discuss some of these great philosophical ideas that developed from since 1650 and on, they have no idea, or they have not heard of it. Or if they have heard it, they do not accept them because they don't look at it more philosophically. They look at it more in the context of Shia. And since Shias are isolated, these thoughts are again imprisoned with it. And so again, that is a great loss for the Muslim community in general, because we have labeled sciences in the context of particular religious communities. So what we have become now is that the time that we were at the cutting edge of civilization and innovations and creations and development and sciences and medicine, all that, that is gone. Where we stand now is that the Muslim contribution to world civilization, now this is a different world, somehow labeled as Western world, definition I don't like myself, but that's a different story, is that the Muslims of today, their contribution probably does not go beyond 2 or 3%, which is a shame. And part of the reason is that there is a lot of political suppression, so a lot of that innovative and creative and imaginative work doesn't get off the ground in the Muslim majority lands. And the few who makes it to the West, these scholars become prominent here in the West. So the brain drain has been a great damaging thing to the Muslim civilization or to the Muslim society today. And this is what we have become. At the time, if people had, if there was an equivalent of the Nobel prizes in science and medicine and philosophy and all that, let's say 1,000 years, Muslims would probably have gotten at least 95% of them. Whereas today, the share of Muslim scholars, Muslim scholarship in general, is, like I said, pretty insignificant. And the few who have made it, they've mostly made it because they've escaped the political suppression in the so-called Muslim lands. So this is my reflection for this month. I hope that you come up with a good critique, and if you have questions, I will be more than happy to entertain them if they are interesting and respond to them if they are serious. I'll wait for your commentaries as well for next month. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sinazai, for a beautiful commentary about our topic today as Muslims who have become. It's great to have you this week as well. We are looking forward to having you again on the third Sunday of next month, which is April. So at the same time, and if there are any questions that are put forward there, we'll forward them to you from the chat box to your attention.
I might as well add that if there are certain topics that our viewers recommend for reflection for next month or the month after, they are more than welcome to suggest their topics. It doesn't mean I'm going to answer them because I may not have the expertise, but it would be interesting to have their contribution as well as their participation in suggesting topics for discussion.
Thank you again, Dr. Sinazai, for this wonderful presentation of as Muslims who we have become. Looking forward to seeing you all next month. Have a nice day.